Okay, and our next speaker, Rita, our next speaker. Are you with us? We can hear you. Please switch on your microphone. Your microphone is off.
How's that?
Okay. Let's try again.
Hello?
Hello. Yeah, we can hear you.
Good evening from Bali.
Oh, thank you, Peter. So let me introduce you to our colleagues. So Peter Wryczayu is PCC coach and founder of International Academy for Deep Transformation and Universal Center for Living Awareness in Bali. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm just checking how to share my screen.
Okay.
How's that? Where are we? Okay, where is... Oh. I think this is it.
Yeah, your presentation is on.
Okay, so we're on. Sorry about that little delay. And very nice to be with you all. And very appreciative to hear the end of Simeonka's presentation, because I feel there's a lot of overlap with what I want to share. I think the first thing I want to say is that there's a whole coaching niche which has to do with preparing and adjusting or helping executives and their family to prepare for and adjust to a new culture, or even to prepare and adjust for a return to their original culture after an overseas posting. I'd like to begin by saying that that's not really the focus of this presentation. My presentation is more some reflections about coaching, cross-cultural coaching, and the honoring and transcending of differences, based quite a lot on my personal experience. I've been running a retreat center in Bali for about 22 years. And in that time, I've had many people come for retreats with individual coaching. And I've also taught and coached in many countries in Europe, North America, and of course, here in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. I was adding up the clients, the number of nationalities that my clients had come from, and it came to about 42 that I could quickly add up. Obviously, some of those nations and cultures I've worked with more deeply than others. To come to introducing what I'd like to share with you this evening about cross-cultural coaching, I think, I mean, I was interested to hear the previous speaker say that she spoke or she worked in about 5 languages. Because when I was thinking about my own background with cross-cultural coaching, I could trace it back to studying languages as an undergraduate, particularly French and Italian. And the fact that there was something about my family of origin that predisposed me to be interested in other cultures and perhaps even to have some distance from my own. My father was from Poland. He didn't raise me, but it already created a difference from a young age. My mother's second partnership was with a man from India. So I had connections with Indian culture. Even though at times I was living in a little village in North Norfolk in England, we had American servicemen from Puerto Rico and the United States living there with their families, and I was fascinated by the difference in food and smells, accent and way of living. Subsequently, I went to Catholic school, which made me part of a kind of religious subculture, the Roman Catholic community, where we had connection with a lot of Irish people, other people from Polish backgrounds, and people that had come to join the school from different parts of China and Hong Kong. So all these things predisposed me a little bit to being open and curious about other people, and perhaps a little bit uncomfortable when I experienced sort of lack of curiosity and chauvinism in some of my own compatriots. I remember the first time that I met a young girl, you know, about the same age as me, about 15 years old, when I was visiting some mutual friends in Norfolk. She was from France, and I tried to use my schoolboy French, and I found that it was very difficult to say anything from all the things that I'd learned in the school, and it was almost as hard for her, when I did manage, to understand what I was saying and for me to understand what she was saying. But there was a very, very beautiful moment where I understood what she was saying. It changed from being a flow of French sounds to actually words that I could understand. And there was that moment of real joy, that feeling that I at last had a kind of bridge where I could enter another universe, another world that was somewhat different from my own, but connected to it. And I think that experience, in a funny sort of way, has been seminal for my whole coaching career. In fact, I moved into coaching, or I evolved into coaching, from studying neurolinguistic programming in the 1980s in the UK and the United States. But in the 1990s, as my work evolved from teaching NLP to developing an approach to coaching that had some roots in NLP, I experienced most of that process living abroad and working and teaching in other countries, to the extent that sometimes I feel I'm a little bit of a foreigner in my own country, and it's quite it's as if I've had more experience coaching in Bali, in Russia, and other countries than I have in my own country, although I have worked with English people who've visited my retreat center. When I think about cross-cultural coaching, I think it's important to consider it from a couple of perspectives. One, I think, is from the perspective of the coach himself or herself, in that when you're working with people from other cultures, it's important to understand your own biases. your own blind spots. And it was very, very strange, because in preparing for this presentation, I was thinking about my own work with different cultures, and I was thinking, oh, you know, I remember clients, I think, oh, maybe there were some blind spots that I'm only beginning to be aware of now. Did I really put my own national or cultural filters on one side, even though I knew how important it was to do so? From the other side, I think it's important for us to be aware of the cultural differences that our clients bring to us. And I think that is true whoever we're dealing with. It's easy to assume that if you're from Russia, that everybody has the same culture, or from England, that everybody has English culture or British culture. It's important to understand that each person brings their own uniqueness, and there's part of that uniqueness that is coming from their culture, and part of it that's coming from their individual life experience. So I think it's quite dangerous to try and learn what are the cultural patterns, for instance, of Dutch people, and assume that your Dutch client is going to conform to those patterns. You know, it may be that you could say that, say, English people are less direct than Dutch people. That Dutch people tend to be quite straightforward and direct in comparison with the way English people tend to go a little bit of a meandering way. But you'll always find English people that are very direct, and Dutch people that can be quite indirect. Sometimes working with clients from another culture can be quite shocking or quite surprising. I mean, I remember doing a mini coaching in Jakarta at an ICF conference, and there was, you know, people who were new to coaching coming, curious about it, wanting to sample it. And one gentleman who had more or less left the steady company, national company that he'd worked for many years, and he was trying to move into the area of helping people develop through coaching. And the issue that he wanted to raise with me was about the need to obtain clients without, as he put it, having to bring a brown envelope. You know, the kind of envelope that you quietly slip under the table or into the person's hand when nobody else is looking. And you know, it's the kind of thing that can happen when you switch context. And as such, it is important to, as far as possible, to be sensitive to the kind of context in which your clients come from. For instance, if I have a young person from Indonesia who's talking about where they're going in their career, and they're talking about how their parents want them, say, to be a doctor, and they want to be an artist. And you realize that it's a very different kettle of fish to someone, say, in the West, who's thinking about a young person who's thinking about their own career. That in Asia, the respect for parents, the respect for family, the tendency to be to prefer to go in the way that everybody else goes is relatively strong. So one wants to make sure that one's not imposing one's worldview on the situation that's in front of one. I hope I'm not speaking too fast for you and that it's okay. I did prepare a quote from one of the pioneers of cross-cultural studies, Edward T. Hall, as something I want to touch during this presentation, maybe not in detail now, but I'd like to move up towards it. He said, Edward T. Hall wrote many of the books that have really provided a foundation for the field of cross-cultural studies. And he lived in New Mexico, and I actually happened to meet him and have lunch with him when I was living there. And he was able to draw on the fact that there were at least 4 different cultures in very close proximity in New Mexico. There were 2 Native American cultures, one the Hopi and the other the Navajo, and some other Pueblo tribes as well. And there were also the Anglos, the people from the more usual North American background who'd come into the area, and the more Hispanic New Mexicans who were descendants of Spanish settlers and been there for hundreds of years. So his work was based on his observation of these and study of these different cultures and how we could come to approach the study of another culture. One of his later books was called Beyond Culture. And he said, man must now embark on the difficult journey beyond culture, because the greatest separation feat of all is where one manages to gradually free oneself from the grip of unconscious culture. And I think this statement is very, very important, because culture does have 2 aspects. One is the aspects of culture that we're conscious of, and the other that may be out of awareness, that's more unconscious. And I think if we're going to do cross-cultural coaching, we need to become more aware of our own culture. And probably the best and perhaps the only way of doing that is to spend a lot of time and, if possible, live in or with other cultures. Because it's only when you rub up against them day to day, both personally and professionally, that you really realize, you know, the potential sources of misunderstanding and friction that can arise from the differences in values. I suppose this quotation also begs the question of what is culture? And I haven't thought about this extensively, but what struck me is that culture is what we identify with collectively. So culture, in a way, is a mirroring on a larger level or a larger scale of our own nature, which is to identify with the story that started when we came into this world, to identify with the family, the education, the language, the customs, and our own personal experience within that. So from our own personal experience, what happens is really, shall we say, somewhere between the individual and the collective. And as such, you could say that every time you coach a client, it's a cross-cultural experience, because you don't have, even if they're coming from the same village as you don't have exactly the same experience. They live in their own world, which is probably in many respects quite different from yours. And at the same time, you could say that there's a lot of similarity between people from different cultures. So I remember when I was working with somebody who came to work with us, actually, and at a certain point he shared with us how, even though he was a very intelligent and rather talented young man, that whenever he was around kind of powerful or educated people, he felt inadequate. And he said, it's as if I've always felt that I'm not good enough. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And he said, yes, you know, even when I was a child, my parents and my family didn't have much money. So they couldn't buy me a bicycle like the other kids, or I didn't have the toys that they had. And from these experiences, he felt that there was something about himself that wasn't good enough, that he wasn't the match of other people. And you could say that this kind of connection between feelings of self-esteem and self-worth are the kind of thing that you could encounter in clients from many other cultures and contexts. So culture is what we identify with collectively, and on the slide you can see some members of my staff in the traditional Balinese garb in the Balinese temple. You can see in the middle one of our elderly staff who is a pemangku, and part of the temple structure where the Balinese go for their festivals. So these festivals, you know, are quite unique. You know, the Balinese ceremonies are a mark of a very unique and special culture. But at the same time, almost everywhere in the world you go, you find that spiritual and religious life is connected with special dress, special attitudes of heart and mind, rituals, connection with energies or forces that are beyond ourselves. So in that sense, culture is a kind of a meeting of three elements. There's something individual, there's something collective, and there's something universal. So if you take the red individual part of that triangle. You can think of it as also what is a unique in a particular person, the particular traits that come out that are manifested in an individual, at the same time as the things that are similar in that individual to other people within that particular collective, or with other collectives. I had the pleasure to write 2 books on meditation and spiritual life with a Balinese psychiatrist. And she was somebody who had a great interest in her own culture and was doing all she could to support it. And at the same time, she was a very strong individual. And as a woman, she made quite a few, shall we say, people who didn't like her, almost enemies, in her professional sphere, because instead of being submissive and low-key, like many Balinese or Indonesian women would be, she was quite forthright and direct, and was very willing to say to men things that even other Indonesian men wouldn't say to them, about things that she felt to be true or important. So you could say that, you know, in some ways she goes against the grain of the culture, and in some ways maybe she's more like, in some respects, people from other cultures. But even those individual and unique differences, you have to see in a kind of relationship with the qualities that they contrast with. And I think, you know, this way of thinking of things as yin and yang, or not just one polarity, but related to its opposite, is something that is perhaps a particular feature of some aspects of Eastern culture, where they tend to look at the relationship between opposites and what transcends them. On this diagram, you have at the apex of the triangle the word universal. And I think you can understand these on 2 levels. It's like when you think of the relationship between the individual and the collective, the individual and the group, the individual and his or her particular culture, there are parts of that life that are sort of fundamentals and universals of human life. No matter who comes for coaching, they were born, and typically they were born to parents, to some kind of family context, in an ideal and usual situation. They will go through childhood, adolescence, they'll eventually take a mate, have a family, grow old, die. They need to eat, they probably need to clothe themselves. And the details of these will vary, and not everybody conforms to all these elements, but many of these things, you could say, are touching the universal. So the question of, you know, what kind of family the client comes from, brothers and sisters, where they are in their life cycle, are in a way where the universal meets the individual, where the universal meets the collective. Universal, of course, has another sense in which we can say that, you know, coming back to Edward T. Hall's notion that men must now embark on the difficult journey beyond culture, because the greatest separation feat of all is where one manages to gradually free oneself from the grip of unconscious culture. So he's talking about the importance of discovering something that is universal in life. And that universality is important because, as we know from experience, culture is, on the one hand, a source of strength and cohesion for people, and on the other hand, it's a source of conflict, frustration, war, suffering. So many people are dying day by day simply because we are unable to resolve our differences at the cultural, individual and cultural level, and to really embrace those differences from a place that is universal. I think I'd like to come back for a couple of minutes to the whole question of language, because language is one of the contexts in which culture manifests very, very strongly. I was lucky last week or the week before to be teaching in French Canada, in Quebec. And there was the interesting context of being in a minority culture within a larger Anglophone culture, where there is a relationship between the Frenchness of Quebec and the Frenchness of France, the English or the Anglo-Saxonness of parts of Canada and the United Kingdom on the one hand, and the United States on the other hand. So there are all these influences mixing together, and language is often a focal point. So there's been quite a lot of efforts to make sure that signage in Quebec is in French, that the French language doesn't become submerged by English. And when we're dealing with different languages, the issue of translation comes up. And it's very, very nice and a little bit unusual to be talking to Russian group, a primarily Russian group this evening, where we're not communicating through translation, although you may be translating some of what I'm sharing into your own language in your head. The German philosopher Walter Benjamin wrote an important essay on the art of translation around the time he was translating some of Baudelaire's poetry into from French into German, I think. And he argued that when you translate, if you're translating properly, you can't go straight from language A to language B. You need to touch something that is universal and that is beyond language A and beyond language B. So that's something within ourselves that has to do with our ability to learn any language when we come into the world. We may be born as little Russians or little Englanders or little Chinese people or little Balinese, but until we've learned a language, we are close to that capacity that we could learn any language to become our mother tongue. So there's something universal about language itself that has to do with, shall we say, the deepest levels of our own experiencing our own consciousness. And I think this is important for coaching, because in a funny sort of way, you could say that the language of the coach and the language of the client are like language A and language B. There are two worlds that are connecting, and they can only really do so when there is a quality of something universal present. And I think that is something that our previous speaker addressed very beautifully. I'm getting a sense that I'm running out of time. Is that right, Alexandra?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes and a lot of questions, actually.
Okay, let's move to questions, and we'll trust that the questions will allow the closing of what I've opened up to come out.
Okay, so the question. In your opinion, how important is to have narrow niche and exact and narrow core audience portrait? Russian coaches and producers always say it is a must and a key to success, but it stops me a bit because I'm enjoying working with different people on different topics. Thank you very much for your interesting and inspirational presentation.
Okay, can you read that to me again?
Okay, so the question is, in your opinion, how important it is to have narrow niche and exact and narrow core audience portrait?
What was the last word?
Portrait.
Portrait?
Yeah.
Okay. Does the question mean how important is it to be quite specialized as a coach?
Yeah. So about specialization, narrow niche.
Personally, it's not my preference. I like to be able to work with quite different people, but I think it has a lot to do with temperament. If you do have a narrow niche, you have a specialization, then you're going to get a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience in relation to that particular area. So there's something positive to be said for it. But no matter how narrow your niche is, from what I've been saying, you still need to be connected with something universal. And the question is, what is that universal? And you could say that universal, we touch it in silence. We touch it in that which is beyond language. So, you know, if you look back at this this slide here, where are we gone? Yeah. Oops. This is from Ferdinand de Saussure, looking at the relationship between the signifier and the signified. So the bottom half of the egg is what you can hear and see. So it's the evident, expressed carriers of meaning. What is signified is invisible. It's invisible because it's in the minds and the consciousness of you as the coach and the client as client. And a lot of talk over the years since Saussure came out with this model has been about how can we soften that line between the signifier and the signified. So how can we have more access to the relationship between what is meant and how it is expressed? And that is why, you know, it's a whole nother topic, but you could say that poetry is very important for therapy and coaching, for working with people, because poetry is the art of softening that line. But a question that I don't think is often raised is, what about the line around the signifier and the signified? And when you erase that line, you take away the separation between different languages, different codes, and you touch something that is universal, that is beyond what is expressed and what it means. And I think the beauty of cross-cultural coaching is that it helps to bring you nearer to that, because you can take much less for granted. And that taking much less for granted is why I prefer not to have too small a niche at this point.
Thank you so much for your answer. We have 4 minutes and a question. Are any specific requirements for a coachee from different culture?
Okay. Say that again. Are there any specific?
Yeah. Are there any specific requirements for a coachee from different culture?
That's an interesting question. For me, there's something about coaching that requires normally, in terms of ICF or international kind of coaching, that requires a certain level of economic or social development. You can coach sport cross-culturally, probably fairly successfully, but would I be able to easily coach in the way that we understand coaching the old farmer who's working in the rice field next to me? I'm not so sure. Probably he could coach me, but it would be a little bit different from what we're usually understanding as coaching when we talk about people making an appointment, coming to see us and having a session. You see what I mean? So I think there's a certain level of education or economic or cultural sophistication that's predisposing one to be ready for coaching. It doesn't mean that you can exclude anybody. I mean, I can coach some of my own staff who wouldn't be obvious clients of mine, but it requires a little bit of a different approach to adjust to them. I mean, that's my cold answer to that, from just thinking about it now rather than reflecting on it in detail.
Thank you so much for your answer. So we are lack of time, and I would like to thank you for joining us today and bring to us this amazing atmosphere of Indonesian evening. So thank you so much for your presentation.
So Alexander, or may I say Sasha?
Yes, sure.
Thank you for moderating this presentation, and to the organizers for the invitation, to the participants for staying with it. I hope it's been of interest to you, and if you want to follow up, you can contact me through Facebook, and I will be in Moscow for a couple of seminars and some evening sessions in the period, I think, from about 14th to 25th of March. So I may be able to see some of you on the same time zone then.
Great.
In the meantime, I wish you the very best for the continuation and closure of your conference.
Thank you so much.